Okay, so finally a new update on the situation between the U.S. and Iran. Some of you may remember that a couple weeks back there was this big hubbub about 4 tankers that were supposedly sabotaged, to use the word from the media report. There were 4 empty oil tankers transiting the Gulf of Oman that were supposedly bombed, but not severely enough to actually sink the tanker, just to do some damage and blow a hole in the side of them. Now, this occurred kind of around the height of the recent U.S.-Iran tensions, when everyone was on sort of high alert as far as a potential war breaking out. And since then, the U.S. has pretty much been saying, oh, well, we think Iran did this. It's pretty much clear to us. We're not going to put any evidence out or anything. But this is all Iran's fault, blah, 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 blah. But then they didn't put up. But now, John Bolton has just come out, and he has said that the UN Security Council will be presented with evidence that Iran did blow up these 4 oil tankers. And, of course, this will be used as evidence of clear Iranian aggression, which, of course, the U.S. really hates military aggression. If there's anything that the U.S. Abhors more than anything, it is military aggression. Now, I'm being facetious, of course, but at this Security Council meeting next week, when the U.S. presents as evidence, I would imagine that they're probably going to try and propose some kind of resolution condemning Iran and calling Iran some sort of military aggressor against, I guess, the United Arab Emirates, and I think it was Norway was one of the other countries where the ships were from. Speaking of the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, it is quite a coincidence that as of today, I believe it was, the news came out, that the U.S. has now entered into a new common security pact with the UAE, which is a nice way of saying that we will fight the UAE's wars for them. Because up until this point, if you think about it, none of the Arab monarchies like the UAE or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia are in NATO, for example. So if they get attacked, the U.S. has no obligation to defend them. But thanks to this new security pact, if we find out at this Security Council meeting next week that, according to the U.S. at least, Iran attacked the United Arab Emirates, well then, the U.S. is bound now by this security pact. They have to defend Iran, or they have to defend the UAE against quote-unquote Iranian aggression and go and fight a war for them. Because, of course, at that point, if Iran can be shown to have attacked a U.S. ally, and the U.S. did nothing to defend them, well, then the U.S. then looks like a bad ally. They're feckless, and then the precedent will be set that anybody can attack a U.S. ally, and that'll be terrible. We'll lose all of our power. So it is imperative that even though Iran is no threat to the security of the United States or of Americans in America, the U.S. must invade Iran and overthrow their government. This is going to be Bolton's case. Now, of course, whatever resolution that is proposed by the U.S. at the UN Security Council will likely be vetoed by China and Russia. Now, given that China and Russia will veto this no matter what, no matter how aggressive or how non-aggressive the U.S.'s resolution sounds regarding Iran, the U.S. may be able to convince a country like, say, France, who otherwise has been a little friendlier to Iran and has wanted to sort of achieve a détente with them and trade with them peacefully, and certainly would not support a war with Iran. They may be, the U.S. may be able to convince their representative at the United Nations to vote with them on this Security Council resolution, since it won't pass anyway. That way, the U.S. can point to China and Russia for vetoing this and saying, see, there's our enemies, China and Russia, vetoing this resolution, and they're the only ones standing up for Iran. So that means Iran's definitely guilty, because only the bad guys are against, passing a resolution against their supposed aggression. And so when the vote on whatever resolution is proposed comes up, watch very closely for how France votes. The U.S. wants, just like they did with Iraq, you want to show a united front of the good guy countries against the bad guy. Remember that in the case of the Iraq War, the French did not support it. I don't know how many people listening to this are old enough to remember, but there was a thing for a couple weeks after the start of the Iraq War that all the restaurants changed the name of French fries to American fries, or freedom fries, even more of a gross euphemism. In fact, I think that this next Security Council meeting is shaping up to look a lot like that infamous stunt performed by Colin Powell at the UN when he testified as to the validity of the intelligence regarding the weapons of mass destruction held by Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which was, of course, later revealed to be untrue. But nevertheless, it was a very dramatic and stirring speech that he gave at the United Nations, and that was a large part of the impetus for entering the Iraq War. I mean, without that speech, I think that you would have had a lot less people convinced. He won over a lot of hearts and minds with that speech. So it'll be interesting to see who presents at the UN this intelligence that Bolton is alluding to. I wonder if it will be Bolton himself, considering he would be the most passionate Iran war hawk. Now, before I forget, this is not the only thing that Bolton is accusing the Iranians of doing and saying that he has evidence to implicate them in. Bolton also is planning to blame Iran for an attack waged by the Houthis on a pipeline in Saudi Arabia. The Houthis, of course, are the main faction in Yemen. They are pretty much the government of most of Yemen. They control the capital and whatnot. And Saudi Arabia has been at war with them since, I believe, 2015. Long before this recent dust-up between the U.S. and Iran. However, it's very convenient for them that these folks, by default, being an enemy of Saudi Arabia in the eyes of the U.S. makes them an absolute Iran proxy, even though that's not really accurate. They are allied somewhat with Iran, but Iran can't exactly do much to help the Houthis aside from offer moral support, considering that Yemen has been blockaded for years. Apparently they have been able to smuggle in some weapons, but they're the only ones willing to sell to the Houthis. Sort of a far cry from being a real Iranian proxy. It's not like the Houthis are fighting on behalf of Iran. I'm sure if the Houthis could, they would stop fighting Saudi Arabia, because it's not like they are trying to invade and terrorize Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia invaded their country and has been trying to subjugate them for years and has been starving civilians. I mean, I just did a video on that a couple days ago or actually yesterday, on discussing the genocide in Yemen. So as dishonest as it may be, Bolton is going to try and tie the actions of the Houthis and say that counts as sort of Iranian aggression, even though the Houthis are acting in defense. Now, one more talking point that Bolton is putting out this morning is that he believes that Iran is currently very rapidly developing nuclear weapons. And he says the proof of this is that Iran left the JCPOA. The Iran deal, as it's called. Bolton says the only reason why Iran would pull out of the Iran deal is if they want to rapidly develop nuclear weapons. Now, of course, the irony of this statement, I don't think it's beyond words at this point, considering that the U.S. and Bolton and everyone like him has been ranting for years about how terrible the Iran deal was and how it never should have been signed, and how on the first day of any Republican getting into office, they should tear up the Iran deal, blah, 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 blah. And of course, Trump did leave the Iran deal, yet Bolton has the gall to sit here and say, oh, tisk, 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 Iran, how dare you leave the Iran deal, when the U.S. has been out of the Iran deal for over a year at this point. I'm shocked that Iran kept up the pretenses of the deal for as long as they did. I mean, if I were, the Iranians, if the Americans decided to pull out of the deal, I would have said, fine, so will I. I'm not going to uphold. How do you have a deal if only one side is holding up their end of the bargain? And how is you, the side that didn't hold up your end of the bargain at all, ever, somehow criticize and castigate the other side for eventually giving up? Now, I have said before that I don't think that there is any immediate risk for a war with Iran. I don't think that the U.S. is going to be invading them this year. I said, if anything, it will be next summer or maybe next spring at the earliest. And so this news would perhaps seem to contradict what I've said in the past and what I still currently believe. But I don't think that's the case, because everything that we're hearing here, all of this rhetoric, all of this hawkishness is coming from John Bolton, and John Bolton alone. And that has not changed. John Bolton has been very hawkish on Iran for as long as he's been in public life, to my knowledge. So he has not changed in his position at all. John Bolton, however, is not the President of the United States. He's not the Secretary of State. He's not the Secretary of Defense. He is the National Security Advisor. He commands no one. He only advises people. I would be much more concerned if we saw a unified chorus from the President, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, perhaps the Secretary of Defense, maybe even some intelligence folks leaking to the media, which, of course, for those of you who don't know, the CIA doesn't really put out press releases. What they do is they have a quote-unquote leak to the Washington Post, which is really just a press release. We've heard nothing like this increasing, the warmongering stance towards Iran. We haven't heard too much war hawking, at least no more than is typical. And of course, for political reasons, I don't think that Mike Pompeo or Donald Trump want to get involved with a war with Iran at this point, because they know that a war with Iran will be disastrous, and so they have to be very careful about the timing of it. If we get involved in a war with Iran this summer, then certainly within a year, the war will be going terribly, and nobody will want to be responsible for that, and the president certainly will have no chance at re-election. And Pompeo, on the other hand, who in all likelihood wants to run for president himself one day, will look like a complete fool for having gotten the U.S. and not been into this war by default, because, of course, it is the Secretary of State's job to lead diplomacy, and a war is what happens when diplomacy fails. So the war would, by default, be Pompeo's responsibility. Neither Trump nor Pompeo have any incentive to want to get into a war with Iran. Only Bolton has that incentive, and that's because Bolton is a principled hawk. Bolton basically sees that any state which is not necessarily willing to bow down to the will of the U.S. should be eliminated because they're a potential threat. So if I had to interpret his actions this week in his speech, I'm thinking that he's trying to build a public case for a war with Iran so that there is such an expectation that the U.S. will invade Iran that he is able to pressure the president into taking that final decisive action. We've heard this in the past, that Trump advisors and people will try and use the media and talk about and say things on TV, knowing that the president watches TV, and use that to influence him because they think that that is more effective than speaking to the president directly. The president is much more influenced by if he sees a story on Fox and Friends, rather than if he hears it from his advisors. So Bolton may be wanting to really increase the warmongering in the media and get, say, the folks on Fox saying, oh, we got to invade Iran, and hope that maybe that will swing the president over. I still don't know if that necessarily will work, but that is a decent plan if that's what Bolton is going for. But ultimately, at this point, even still, I will revisit this after the Security Council meeting and see how things go there, and see how France votes, and see how if the administration in general, other than Bolton, starts changing their tune. But for now, I still think that we are safe until summer of 2020. I think I'll cut this off here. So if you got anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell, because I will be keeping an eye on this situation and just about everything else that I can consume as far as the news goes. And I hope that I will see you folks back here tomorrow.